Now I would like to give the floor to Marina Hанхалаева, representing Buryatia.
Самый. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Marina. I'm from Buryatia. Buryats are the native people of the territories around Lake Baikal. We are the most numerous native people of Sibiri and the only people in Sibiri that had our own written history and literature before Russian colonization. Buryatia was part of the Mongolian world and an important part of the international trading system of Central and East Asia. In the 19th centuries, after 138 years of bloody war, Buryats were occupied by Russia. Buryats went through forced Christianization, which had a traumatic effect on the entire population. All attempts of organized resistance were harshly punished. Entire villages were slaughtered, women and children were forced into slavery. In the era of the Russian Empire, Buryatia became a place of mass settlement of Russian peasants and had a huge number of prisons. In Soviet times, so-called collectivization destroyed thousands of families. Buddhist works on philosophy, medicine, and astrology, and Buryatia's great Buddhist heritage were destroyed as well. In the USSR, there were more than 150 Buddhist monasteries and 23,000 monks. After repressions of 1930s, only 600 monks left. About 20,000 representatives of the Buryat intelligentsia were executed. In the 1930s, the Kremlin officially replaced the Buryat writing system with the Cyrillic alphabet. Buryats were killed just for speaking their own language or studying in monasteries. In 1937, Buryatia was divided into 5 parts. Buryatia lost 40% of the ethnic Buryat population, and ethnic Russians became the majority. In the 1970s, the Buryat language was completely banned in schools, and generations of Buryats grew up not knowing their own language. I'm one of them. In 2020, changes were made to the Russian constitution, making Russian the only state language of Buryatia. The goal has been to accelerate Russification of Buryats and change the ethnic composition of the region. Buryatia has not recovered from these events. According to UNESCO report, Buryat language is an endangered language and can disappear completely by year of 2050. Russia is unable to build a federation. Russia's republics are actually colonies. Russian power in the colonized republics is maintained by 3 factors. First, corruption. Corrupt local elites who control local politics in the republic under the supervision of the Kremlin and maintain pro-Russian agenda. Second, violence. Dozens of national activists, politicians, and journalists are imprisoned or killed by FSB. The survivors leave Russian territory. Third, propaganda. Truthful journalism is destroyed. History taught in schools is designed to raise Buryat children to become patriots of Russian metropole. In 1992, puppet representatives signed a federal treaty with Russia, and Buryatia joined the Russian Federation without a real consent of Buryat people. Russia remains a dictatorship which has decided to finally resolve the issue of native people. The invasion into Chechen Republic and the genocide organized there in the point where the empire was reborn. At the same time, Russia has been actively pursuing a formal policy of depriving native people of their territories. In 2008, two Buryat autonomous districts, Usterda and Taginsky, were decommissioned by Moscow. Russian government is racist and chauvinistic. Native people in Russia experience colossal level of racism. In Moscow and other Russian cities like St. Petersburg, it is very difficult to rent an apartment or find a job for a person of non-Slavs appearance. Bullying in schools, assaults, and racially motivated murders are common in Russia. If crime is committed by non-Slavs, then this will be emphasized in the news reports. Nazism has become the de facto state ideology of Russia, and this is widely supported by the population. Many Slavic Russians believe in their civilizational superiority over neighboring people. This brought us to a full-scale chauvinistic war in Ukraine. Russia uses native people as cannon fodder. For Buryat, the probability of being mobilized and dying in the Ukraine war is 275 times higher than for residents of Moscow or St. Petersburg. There is no Russian gas, there is no Russian oil or Russian diamonds. All these are resources extracted from the land of native people. Billions of dollars go to finance Russia's imperial projects, from the sale of Khanty-Mansiysk oil, Yakutian diamonds, Buryat gold, or uranium. Every year, millions of hectares of Siberian forests are burned down, a large part of which is the result of arson. A village in the Shoria region was burned down after a Russian company found large deposits of coal. Lake Baikal is the main symbol of the Buryat people. Lake Baikal is the largest freshwater reserve on the planet, and it's suffering an ecological catastrophe. This is caused by Russian legislation, and this is leading to irreversible environmental consequences affecting the entire world. Native people are being robbed by Moscow corporations. Buryats and other people live in poverty primarily because of the unfair distribution of taxes between colonies and the metropole. 40 to 70% of natural resources taxes go to Moscow. Corporations using corruption and schemes avoid paying significant part of their taxes to colonies. Activists from Buryatia have founded an independence movement. The mission is to unite Buryat people around the idea of freedom and independence. We want to build an independent democratic state that will protect the interest of all the people of Buryat Republic, regardless of their race, religion, or any other differences. Captive nations need your support. The only way is independence. To do this, we must educate new free-thinking leaders. We need to train professionals and specialists who will ensure the prosperity, development, and security of the new Buryat state. They will bring new values to our oppressed and brainwashed society. We are determined. We are ready to act. We urge the European Parliament to meet and discuss our further cooperation. Thank you very much.